Hey everybody, it's Keith. Welcome to Wednesdays in Bed with Keith. So a lot of people have asked me about my dad, and my dad was the quiet one. He was sort of like in the background, though his presence, I would find out in later years, was clearly there. My mother just sort of, pushed herself to the forefront, and that's how she liked it. And but my father started his life with a meager existence and a sad existence, honestly, because his mother died tragically when he was just about to turn 3 years old. So he was raised without a mother. He had a stepmother who was not very kind to him, borderline abusive, and he was able to take all of that and break the cycle and become this really, really wonderful, loving human being. But you know, at least I didn't actually appreciate that until I could see the entire story. So when springtime comes, I think of my father a lot. I think of him because he was the one who taught me how to cut the lawn, and I would sit on his lap and we'd go around on the lawnmower, and then it became my job. And he taught me how to take care of our swimming pool. He just taught me a lot of stuff. He did the same with my brothers. They did more like the carpentry stuff and the hard labor, if you will, whenever he had to, I don't know, reseed the lawn or something. But in the springtime, sports would be abounding, and primarily baseball. And my father loved baseball, and he was a coach for Little League. And I wanted to please him, so I started to play on the Little League. But it just wasn't my thing. Like, I couldn't stand the pressure of, like, the parents primarily. And one day my mom was sitting there and this woman next to her was yelling, "Get that kid off the mound. He stinks," and all this kind of stuff. And in the meantime, she's talking about her own kid. And my mom was like, "That's just crazy. Like, who does that?" So I went to my father and I said to him, "Look, I don't want to play sports anymore. I want to play in the neighborhood because I loved it and I sort of was a little star. Well, I wasn't really a star, but I could get the ball where it had to go. In my mind, I was a star, and I still am. But so I had to tell my father, and I was really nervous about doing that. And instead, my dad is like, "Okay, that's fine." He said, "You don't have to play on the team." He said, "But I want you to play something and do something." He goes, "So let's go outside and throw the ball." And he took me outside, and he was very Ward Cleaver, and we sort of like passed the ball back and forth and talked. And I remember that day so fondly for multiple reasons, but one of them was I didn't disappoint him. And if I did disappoint him, he didn't show it or make me feel that I had disappointed him. And that's how he lived his life. I never ever felt like I disappointed my father, and he never made me feel like I disappointed him. He was just a really solid man. So because my dad didn't have a mother, he married a woman who was his mother, and what a mother she was. And she would like lay out his clothes. Like if they had to go out somewhere during the week was fine because he sort of wore just like blue khakis and a white shirt with his little name engraved over here, Hank. Even though his name was Henry, they called him Hank. And he was all set and ready to go. But when they would go out, she would like put out his pants and his shirt and his socks. And one day, she and I are sitting in the living room and we're talking, and all of a sudden he comes walking down the hallway, and he's like, "Eid," he goes, "I don't know what happened. My pants shrunk." And my mother and I turn around and look at him, and he's actually got on these pants, which are sort of like capri on him. Like they're like mid-calf pants. And my mother goes, "Oh my God, those are my pants." And he's like, "Well, you laid them out for me." And she's like, "I didn't lay them out for you. I laid them out for me." And he's like, "Well, how am I supposed to know?" So she goes, "Get the hell down that hallway and take off those pants." So he just goes sulking down the hall and she looks at me and she goes, "I just worry sometimes." She goes, "If anything happens to me," she said, "what the hell is he going to go around town looking like?" So that was basically how she sort of mothered him a little bit. And that was just one of multiple things. But so one day I was in the backyard playing with my friend Parker, and we have a stream that runs not on our property, but behind our property. And we were fishing for like tadpoles or whatever. And Parker turns to me and he goes, "Hey, do you know where you came from?" So I was like, "Yeah." I said, like I was delivered to my mother and father. And he was like, "No." He goes, "Your dad," I'm going to clean this up a lot. He goes, "Your dad put his penis inside your mother and you came out. And I was like, no way. Like, I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't imagine that my father would do that to my mother. I couldn't imagine my mother wanted him to do it to her. So I was just like, oh my God, that's crazy. So I go trotting back to the house, and my mother is there, and she's ironing like sheets or tablecloths or something. And I'm just staring at her, and she's like, what is wrong with you? So I said, well, Parker told me. And then I proceeded to tell her, that Daddy put himself inside of you, and I came out. And my mother was like, oh, dear God. She was like, here we go. So she goes to our linen closet. She pulls out this pouch. It was like a silk pouch, pink. I'll never forget it. It had like lace on it. And inside are all these books about procreation. And she sits me down and she starts teaching me the birds and the bees. And I still can't believe it. The whole thing didn't make any sense to me. So when my father comes home from work for dinner, she says, how was your day? And he's like, oh, it was good. We got this contract. We did that job, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, how was yours? And she goes, well, your son came home today and told me that you put yourself inside of me. And that's where he came from. And I had to teach him the birds and the bees. You got out of that one, didn't you? And my father was like, oh, like, what? Like he just missed the bullet. So years later, he and I are doing this project together. We're building this pool house. And my dad is teaching me so in the foundation, there's these metal bars and they're called rebar. And he takes his fingers and he lubes it up with Vaseline. He's like, now Keith, you have to lube up, this is called the male, and you lube up the male. And then you take the female receptacle and you have to slide the female down on the male. And my mother I'm cracking up. And my mother just looks at him and she goes, oh, right. She goes, where the hell were you when Parker came home and told him that you put yourself inside of me and he came out? She goes, now, 20 years later, you're teaching him the birds and the bees? Oh, that is just so typical. So I was like, whoop, there you go. Mom again. So my father was good at everything. Like, he could do anything. He was one of those guys that just knew a lot about a lot. And you needed electrical, you needed something, but his primarily carpentry and things like that. He was wonderful at. So one day he was at my house and he was cleaning something up. He had dropped something, and I noticed that he couldn't put the dustpan and the brush together. Like, it was one of those kits. And I brought it up to my mother, and she was like, yeah, he's been doing weird things lately. And so she took him to the doctor, and much to our dismay, it turns out he had this very rare neurological disease, which there was no cure for, so we knew that life was going to change dramatically. So as it progressed, he became sort of like more, his cognitive function wasn't great, and he was having problems talking and eating, but he went to adult daycare to give my mother a break. And one day I pick him up and he's coming home from the daycare and he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out this thing in a bag. And I said to him, Daddy, what's that? And he was like, they were having a craft sale and I bought your mother a Christmas gift. Now, this would be the last gift that he ever gave her because he passed away that year. So we're sitting around and talking, and he shows it to me, and it's this bubblegum pink and white crocheted scarf. And you had to know my mother. That was just not her style, but it was so sweet that he bought it for her. I paid $2 for it, he said. So I was like, Mommy's gonna love it. So anyway, I wrap it up for him, and my mother had this thing about the presents, and she wanted to always save the best for last or whatever. That's what she used to say. I don't even know how she qualified that, but so I presented her with this gift and I said, this is your gift and this is from Daddy. And then I hand her the gift and I lean in and I said, if you don't make a fuss over this, I will put you in a nursing home. And she just looked at me and she was like, what? So she opens it up and sure enough, she's like, oh my God, Henry, I love it, I love it, I love it. And the smile on his face was just so radiant. Like, he had thought he had done the best thing ever. And actually he did. And that was the kind of man he was. He was so generous and he gave of himself. He thought about others before he thought about himself. He would, do tasks for people. He would help them build things. He would offer his advice in any way he could. He would actually even build with them. But one night there was this horrible blizzard, and this was when I was about 10 years old, and my dad worked about 15 minutes away from our house, and he wasn't coming home, and an hour goes by, 2 hours go by, 3 hours go by. My mother's frantic, and then all of a sudden he comes up the street, and she was like, "Where the hell were you?" And he said, "Well, I had the pickup truck, and as I was driving home, if I would see people by the side of the road, I would pick them up and drive them home so that they got home safely." So that was like one of those moments where you look at your father and you think, even though I was like 10 years old, I thought, what a good man. Like, it was just such a good man. Like, so it hopefully was passed on to me. I like to think that I am part of my father. But my dad was like dark chocolate. And I say that because when I was little, I didn't love the taste of dark chocolate. I loved chocolate, but I didn't understand the dark chocolate. So I was very connected to my mother. And my father, as I got older, I realized was my dark chocolate. Because I love dark chocolate. Like, I appreciate dark chocolate, and I can't get enough of it. And so as I look back on my father's life and our relationship together, I realize that sometimes there is such good right in front of you, and you just sort of take it for granted. And then as the time goes on, that good becomes all the more savory and sweet. And you just have to love it. And I think of my father every day. Since he died, I do not celebrate Father's Day, but my mother had a saying, and she would say, if you can't celebrate your parents every day, please don't bother on one Hallmark holiday. And I think there's a lot of merit in that and a lot of credibility. So I just wanted to take today and celebrate my father and say that I love him.